So thank you all for joining us today. The Aurora Chamber of Commerce is very grateful for the way the provincial government has supported our members by being accessible through these types of open dialogues. Today, the Honorable Rod Phillips, Ontario Minister of Finance, and Michael Parsa, MPP for Aurora Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill, and Parliamentary Assistant to the President of the Treasury Board are joining us. We will begin with introductions, followed by opening remarks. I have some opening questions that we'll take, and then we'll take questions that were either previously sent in by email or those posted to the chat today. So without taking any more time, I'll turn it over to MPP Michael Parsa.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you're all keeping well and enjoying this incredibly amazing Free Canada Day that we're having. I know everyone's experiences over the past few months have been a little different. More likely than not, the global pandemic has affected your business or businesses in some shape or form. We're here today to directly hear from you on how your businesses have been affected and the ways in which we facilitate the quickest and most effective economic recovery for your business and our province. Now, just remember, now that we have the Minister of Finance with us, please be as candid as possible and provide some recommendations and solutions on how you think we can help as a province. So Sandra and everybody, without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you the Minister of Finance, the Honourable Rod Phillips.
Thanks very much, Michael, and thanks, Sandra, and thanks to the Aurora Chamber of Commerce for putting this together. As Michael knows, and as Sandra, as you referenced, we've been trying very hard to take opportunities to check in throughout this pandemic. You'll remember back, it seems like a very long time ago, but to middle of March. And in the middle of March, I was just getting ready to present our annual budget. And it was the typical budget, 5-year budget, and the kind of plans that we normally make. We were actually coming last year out of the largest single year of job creation in the province's history, and had a number of challenges on the horizon for certain, but we're moving towards a balanced budget and a number of other items. And in a very short period of time, we needed to pivot, along with everybody else, particularly in our business community, needed to pivot to the reality of a global pandemic and the challenges that came with that. So day by day, I think everybody has been working their way through the economic as well as, of course, the health impacts. We've seen very good progress thanks to the 14.5 million people in Ontario in our jurisdiction on the health side, and we're not out of that by any measure. And Michael and I'd be happy to answer questions about the plans in that regard and the progress we're making on the health front. But very specifically and really early in this, back in the beginning of April, the Premier asked me initially to pull together a team of his ministers, which was later configured into a cabinet committee specifically committed to jobs and recovery. And that's what we've been working on really ever since. So part of that is around the focus on reopening, and I'm happy to answer questions specifically around that. Part of that has been the very close work with the federal government around their programs and the various things as well that we launched with our $17 billion program back in March of direct and indirect supports for healthcare communities and businesses. And also it's been around our plans for what will be a budget in November, an unusual budget. We don't usually have budgets in November, but in March I set out just a 1-year plan because we really didn't have the opportunity then to have the kind of perspective we need. So in November of this year, we'll lay out a multi-year plan that will include a lot of the things we want to do around recovery. So today it would be great to hear about ideas that you have in that regard, the specific situations that you're facing right now, and very much in real time, because again, with our federal and local government colleagues, we're working specifically around that. And I should just shout out Michael's role. Michael is also the parliamentary assistant to my colleague, the president of the Treasury Board. So he's one of the handful of us that work very closely around managing the finances and the spending of the government. But he's also been a great colleague of mine in terms of staying very much in touch touch with the reality on the ground that our smaller and medium-sized businesses are facing, to try to make sure that, for instance, when the initial rent program was brought out, there was a number of challenges with it, that we were able to make some adjustments to that. A lot of the changes that have been made to various programs have been through feedback from Michael and other of our colleagues. So we're all ears and willing to listen, willing to answer whatever questions you have as well. But thank you again for your time. And Sandra, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. So I think much of what we have right now is questions. And then I'm hoping that if people have suggestions and other things, that they'll put that into the chat as well. We'll start with a few of the questions that we had, preliminary questions, your opening questions. So we're hearing from several businesses in Aurora that the landlords are refusing to apply for the CERCA subsidy, or they are holding tenants hostage, or I don't know what the right word is, and will only pay if they renew their lease for 3 or more years. Can you tell us what the uptake has been from landlords? Do you know why many landlords are choosing not to apply for the rent subsidy?
No, thank you. So I'm just going to look at my phone. I apologize because I have very recent statistics on that. So I want to make sure that I give you the most current statistics. So currently we have the program affecting, I think we have about 12,500 tenants. The number of landlords is obviously less than that. We have a number of the large tenants, whether that's Oxford or Cadillac Fairview, some of the very big, the power centers, who are submitting. One of the issues with the program, it's unfortunate the way it was set up, is that landlords, whether they're smaller or larger, can only make one submission. So the very largest landlords are submitting them en masse. So there'll be large numbers of tenants therefore affected if let's say in Oxford properties or the power centers people come in. So we've seen, I guess, quite a big uptick when the prohibition was put in place or announced relative to evictions, and so that I guess is a positive sign in terms of participation. So I expect at the end we'll see tens of thousands of tenants. I mean, we're at 12,000 now, and we know that the largest landlords haven't submitted their applications yet. There was also discussion today about and the Prime Minister announced and the Premier said we would support a 1-month extension. So it's currently a 3-month program, the extension of it for a 4th month. So those are discussions we've had ongoing with the federal Finance Minister. So I think that's the really currently, just literally got the from Canada Mortgage and Housing, got it on my text. So that's the most current update in terms of tenants and landlords.
Okay, thank you for that. Many of the businesses are concerned about moving forward and how a second wave might be handled. Are there alternative strategies to the stage 1, 2, 3 approach, or a different way to handle it altogether if it happens?
Great question. So we are looking very closely at what we learned through the first wave, and our objective, and I think all of us have to be, certainly those of us in government have learned we have to be kind of humble about what we can and can't do and know what's possible. But the objective of the very staged process that we've been going through, we announced at the end of April, we're now in stage 2 in all but a very small part of the province, moving to stage 3 in the weeks ahead, has been to not have to retreat and take steps backward, to be able to manage the process, because during that process we've also been increasing capacity. Some of you will have seen what happened in Kingston. You might have noticed late last week where there was an outbreak in the nail bar, and what was most reassuring about that was the rapid way that the Kingston area public health officials, along with the acute care facilities, were able to handle that situation. What I've been saying for a number of months now is when we look at other jurisdictions, what we've learned across the world is that there are 2 things that happen everywhere where the economies reopen. There are flare-ups, and things like what happened in Kingston. We also had a similar situation in London. We've seen that we have to be able to handle those flare-ups, and the extent that we can do that, that means that we don't have to go backwards in terms of lockdowns or other things. The second thing that we know has happened everywhere in the world is fewer people come back initially, whether that's businesses that could open but choose not to, or employees that come back to the businesses because there's things like the SERP and other factors, but also just people being concerned about coming back to work, and fewer customers come back initially. So our hope is that when we have a second wave, and I don't say that because I know there will be one, but I say that because I think it's prudent that we plan for it. When we have a second wave, we'll be able to, on a case-by-case basis, respond to those impacts. We'll be able to keep the momentum that we have on the health side. We've, of course, learned if we have to go back into some form of reduced accessibility for businesses and services, we've learned a lot, but that's not our first preference. Our first preference would be able to maintain the momentum we have, maintain the education that we've seen in terms of people, and utilize the capacity. You've seen us surge testing to up to over 30,000 in some cases when it's necessary across the province. So be able to surge testing and contact tracing capacity so that we can manage it and still keep the economy more open than we did during those initial shutdowns in March and April.
Right. Thank you. There was a question about PPE expenses and whether they would be treated as regular operating expenses for a business, or will they be treated differently? Do you believe there will be any government support for businesses who are now having to spend extra dollars to meet safety requirements?
We have provided, in terms of being able to locate PPE, I know Michael could provide this, but we've provided access to it, so a web portal in terms of all the various people offering it. In terms of the treatment of PPE as an expense and other things, those are the things we're going to be looking at. We, as I mentioned, have the November budget to look to those kind. And that's actually, it's interesting. That's only the second time I've heard that idea, so that's why it's great to have these sessions. In terms of direct subsidy for it, right now we're really focused on making sure that the health system, which in this case includes the broader health system of long-term care and that, have access to PPE. So we've made some great steps in that. I'll tell you, one of the things we are looking at is whether there's the opportunity for the province to become an aggregated buyer of PPE to reduce some of the costs, even if it is going to be a cost, it still has to be borne by business. But because of the volumes that we're having to buy for the public health system, and not just the health system, but the prison system, all those areas, whether or not there's an ability to drive some real discounts so that the private sector could take advantage of that. So those are sort of three areas where we're looking at it right now. But I do appreciate the suggestion around treatment as an expense.
Okay, thank you. There was just a follow-up question to the 12,500 landlords that submitted. There's a question around what percentage for that. Do you know what the percentage that would be?
So those were tenants. The number I gave you was for tenants, not for landlords. It's complex because tenant eligibility is to know the actual number of tenants. You'd have to know the number of eligible tenants, which would say how many were affected by COVID, which isn't the sort of thing that the government has visibility on. Fair to say that there are certainly, I'm sure there are tens of thousands of businesses that, so more than 10,000 for sure have been impacted in the way that we've talked about. If you think about restaurants and others that have likely been affected to the degree necessary, but there isn't a way for us to see through the data to see just how many tenants there are who would have been impacted to the degree that to be eligible.
Okay, thank you. There's been a massive advertising campaign about safety precautions that citizens should take. What is the province doing to support the return of customers to local businesses? Can business owners expect a campaign encouraging people to shop local or shop just going into shops?
You can. In fact, and Michael would have been doing this too, but part of this is what we'll consider, I guess, an earned media approach through people like our local MPPs. I've been doing a tour and did media on Friday in the Markham Unionville area, did that for the opening of Square One. Our premier will be out, and of course he's attracting a lot of well-earned attention these days. So I think part of it is demonstrating that we are able to be and participate, be out and around, and then that'll be supported by paid media in terms of encouragement. Right now, the thing that people need most is because we've done a fair bit of research around this, and I'm very interested if there's other thoughts people have, but I've been hearing it is confidence. As I said, one of the realities of every place that's reopened is that fewer people come back initially. And then over time, in the places that have been successful, people see the combination of the health statistics with, maybe they drive by a patio a couple times and they see people on it and they go, oh, maybe we should go there for dinner. These are like any economic situation, but now with the health overlay about people's confidence and comfort. And I don't know, Michael, would you like to comment on that? Because I know we've been talking about, you were part of that briefing we received the other day from with our research team about the sorts of things people are looking for, but you probably could bring some insight in terms of your experience.
Oh, you nailed it, Minister. It's about confidence. You know, it's going to take some time for people to once again get back to it. They were skeptical quite, you know, when we started, but you can see that when businesses are open, slowly they are seeing that their clients are returning. And as then they see more people showing the return to these businesses, more and more people will follow suit. I myself, just before we got this call, I'll be posting it on my social media. I've been out all morning and afternoon visiting businesses, and I will do so right after this call. I have Plaza and Aurora to go to visit businesses and to convey the same message that we got to get out, we got to support these local businesses. And it's very important because, as you know, Minister, we've talked about this many times, these local businesses are truly what make our local communities. They're the ones who support our local sports teams. They're the ones who support our local, you know, legions and chambers and fundraisers that we have. So they are truly what make our community. So we got to make sure that we're all there to support them, and we will all be there.
And interestingly enough, I mean, from the town of Aurora's perspective, we put together an Aurora Business Continuity Task Force early on in the process. And one of the things that we are implementing right now is an Explore Aurora Shop Local campaign. And we have people on the line. The Mayor Maracas is online with us, as is Watershed Marketing, and is Jennifer Ettinger, who are all part of that campaign and getting it off and running. So we are doing exactly that for our town.
It is, I'll tell you, I think that's excellent, because what we're seeing in terms of people's willingness to travel is rather limited. So I think at this stage, people are becoming comfortable maybe going to the next town or within their community. The idea that we're going to be this summer encouraging everybody to go to Niagara Falls, maybe, but that isn't it's going to be about people exploring and understanding their own areas. So we'll be encouraging that. It is, you know, we don't know what will happen with the border, for example, although at this stage there's quite a bit of hesitance, as you'd appreciate, in terms of, you know, what happens with the usual kind of flow of American tourists. Not such a big deal in places like Ajax and Aurora, Ajax being my home riding, and Aurora, but still important. So it's going to be a lot more about local dollars being spent locally. So good for you. And of course, great. I'm not surprised that the mayor is taking that initiative.
Yeah, thank you. The last question before we go into the submitted questions are, your government was elected on the basis of eliminating the deficit. What do you foresee the impact of COVID-19 being in the next 3 to 5 years on managing the financial deficit?
Well, it's going to make it more difficult. You know, as I said, we were on track to balancing the budget. You know, Ontario is the largest sub-sovereign debtor in the world. That was a situation we inherited, excess of $350 billion of debt. What that means is the fourth largest expense that we have every year is paying interest on that debt. The good news is that the approach that had been taken restored a fair bit of confidence in the credit markets because we were moving in the right direction. And I think, relatively speaking, Ontario is seen as a fiscally prudent jurisdiction. But the reality is we went from that path to balance to a deficit that we projected would be in excess of $20 billion for this year. And frankly, that was fairly early in the process of understanding COVID. So I think all governments are going to have to look at their fiscal, being fiscally prudent. But right now is not that time. Yeah, we always have to be careful with taxpayers' dollars, and I can assure you that Michael, particularly in his job working with the President of the Treasury Board, one of his important roles is making sure that every dollar we spend is spent very, very carefully. But right now is, you plan for a rainy day. This is the rainy day. So we are going to be addressing it, all of us, over the long term. Similarly with the federal government, we're going to see record federal deficits for sure, and likely record provincial deficits for sure. But I think that is appropriate at this time to address the concerns, to make sure we make the investments, and then we're going to have to all focus very much on returning to balance, but I think that's going to happen in the time frame, that right now it's not about that. Right now it's about making sure that the resources are in place to support people, our healthcare system, and the businesses, and that's what we're seeing around the world.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So we're going to get into the submitted questions now, and many of these are specific issues that people are having or questions that they have about their business. So our company, our company serves public libraries across Canada, providing print, books, and other services. They are funded by the cities and municipalities they serve. These cities, like Toronto and everywhere else across the province of Ontario and throughout Canada, have been hard hit by substantial loss of revenue and considerable additional expenses. It is my understanding that they cannot run a deficit. Is there a plan to assist these cities and municipalities by the Ontario government in conjunction with the federal government? The only alternative they have is tax increases or devastatingly massive cuts to service and staff.
Yeah, so we have been working from the day one with our municipal partners. We provided about $250 million of support in the March statement, as well as, and this was their suggestion, and it was a great suggestion they made, and we listened to it, allowing for the deferral of about $1.8 billion of property taxes, both residential and commercial. So that support will continue, and we continue to work with mayors. The federal government has signaled their willingness to be supportive as well. The questioner is quite correct. At this time, municipalities aren't able to run a deficit. That's obviously one option, but we understand as well, and Steve Clark, our Minister of Municipal Affairs, has been in close contact through the Association of Municipalities and large urban mayors and others with discussions about how we deal with this. The issue has, much like on the provincial and federal level, the biggest issue has been revenue in terms of particularly those municipalities that have, more or are part of more sophisticated transit operations or recreation fees, but they've also had some additional costs. So those are things I think we'll work through together. We've continued to do that. When it comes to libraries, just because the individual mentioned libraries, in our phase 3, that would include some further opening. So part of it, libraries have been a little bit restricted in terms of their ability to operate, and that's obviously been as well a challenge in that regard. So, we hope in the next step, stage 3, not phase 3, we'll be able to get to the broader accessibility of those services, obviously with appropriate physical distancing.
Okay, thank you. For small businesses that are positioned in stage 3 to reopen, is the government extending rent relief? Well, you just answered this, that it's being extended by another month.
Yep.
And will they consider complete rent abatement from July 1st, 2020 until we are allowed to reopen? The CERCA assistance program expires in June. Is there a discussion? Yes. So we did talk about that. There is a discussion, an extension for a month, sorry.
That's right. Yeah, and rent abatement, which I guess would be no rent. I mean, that again, there are 1.2 million sort of leases. Not all of those are COVID affected leases, but there are things that are not within the capabilities of even the federal government with their printing press in terms of that. So we're very sensitive to the rent issue. As people will see, we put the eviction ban in place, and that has encouraged more landlords to take part. I'd encourage people who are getting very specific feedback from their landlord to feed that into Michael's office. And I know I've talked to Michael. He shared with me, we were chatting on Friday about this. There's some specific cases. We're working quite closely with Minister Morneau's office and Canada Mortgage and Housing to amend the program. You would have seen not just that program, but there were amendments to the small business liquidity program on Friday, or you may not have seen, but there were changes made there based on the feedback I received from Michael and others about making the program accessible for sole proprietors and others to make that liquidity available also through a variety of credit unions. So I have to say both the federal and provincial government are trying to get the money out into the system. And so if there are specific instances, please feed them into Michael. And he does a very good job of getting them to me, and we work with the federal government to try to make sure the program's responsive.
Great, which we have been trying to do as well. This is again a landlord question. My question would be what the plan is for the businesses that are unable to apply for CERCA because their landlord is not qualified. In my case, my landlord has a line of credit on his property, and for that reason, the 7 units affected in his building do not qualify.
Yeah, so it isn't, and again, maybe Michael can get me the details to my staff member who's on this call. I don't know how a line of credit would affect eligibility. There were early on. Again, there's been, and I say this, I think we need to be transparent about this. we've been learning as we go. The federal government's been learning as they go. The commercial rent program has had 4 different iterations in terms of eligibility, as quite frankly, conversations like this brought forward issues that at the beginning, the program was not eligible for those who didn't have a mortgage. It also only dealt with net rent, not gross rent. These are just 2 examples of many alterations that have been made. So maybe we can get the details on that and just confirm the lack of eligibility, because it wouldn't be obvious to me why that's the case.
Okay.
If it is, then that gives us some feedback to, again, go back to the federal government. We are funding $250 million of the program, but it is their program, so we have to feed changes.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. The Northern Karate Schools has 15 locations in the GTA. They employ 60 plus full-time employees and 200 plus part-time employees, who in turn service 12,000 students attending at least 1 time per week. Last year, 2019, they paid about $1 million in HST and pay various government and employment taxes. Now 98% of martial arts schools are not members of a personal service organization, have not been given a green light to reopen. They are made up of part-time sports people who hold other jobs. They are professionals who provide livelihood and well-being to thousands of Ontarians on a daily basis. The question is simply, is this not business discrimination?
There's very little that's fair about a global pandemic. And there is very little, when we had to have essential businesses open, there's very little that was fair about the fact that some businesses, because they had grocery operations, for example, were able to be open, except that we had to make sure that people had access to food. And some of those operations had other elements of their business embedded. This isn't to be callous or not reflective on this. I've spoken to many, including many of the sports training businesses that have very legitimate positions, and I surely don't want to upset the people who are in the karate business, because that would be the last thing I'd ever want to do. But we are trying, working with our medical professionals and our science professionals, to get to the place where we can have broad-based openings, and we've seen some real progress on that front, including for many sports, but not all of them. And that is really just reflective of the best science and the best health advice. And so we work and we advocate to see as many businesses open as we can. But I think the progress that Ontario has seen is really a result of having listened closely to that advice and being as flexible as we can, but listening to the advice from our public health professionals. We don't have to look too far south of the border to see the impacts where that advice hasn't been taken. And as I said, our objective when we get to stage 3, which again is a matter of, it's weeks, not months from now, assuming we keep making the progress, is to see the sustained opening of those businesses. And listen, as the Minister of Finance, and I don't say this lightly, I would dearly like to see the tax revenue and the employment and people have their businesses back and their work back, and all those students be able to be back. But we have kept to the discipline of listening to the best science and the best health advice. We are very hopeful that even with limitations, come the stage 3, businesses will be able to be open, and then we'll all be adapting to that new normal.
Thank you. And I'm sorry for jumping around a little bit, but someone has asked, is there any thought, is for a little more clarification, is there any thought to applying for rent relief if your landlord refuses to apply, even though you're eligible and he's eligible?
Listen, the Premier has said this, that we're leaving all options on the table in terms of approach, but to this. But one of the things, and again, this is why if there's specific information that if you've given it to Michael already, then I'm sure he's passed it on. But if there's specific circumstances that are causing that to be the case, it's just helpful for us to know. Obviously, any program like this, we're not going to have 100% participation from every landlord, of which there are many across the province, but it is the case that we want to make sure we understand why they're not participating.
Okay, yeah, and Michael does have the information for that one.
Great.
As a small business, we are not anticipating recovery in September, given that we are operating at less than 40% capacity, given the social distancing guidelines published by the Ministry of Health. Is there any opportunity to consider extending CEWS, Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy Program, before August to help to keep employees engaged? Now, I know that's a federal program,
That's something so first of all, one of the things that we are trying to make sure evolve as the health situation improves are some of the physical distance, if not the physical distancing. I don't know that that's going to change in the near future, but the capacity limitations and other things that are affecting businesses, we're working with the public health and frankly getting feedback from specific businesses through our Ministry of Labor and through these kinds of processes, trying to make sure that we are adapting to give businesses as much flexibility as they can so that their capacity can come up. But that said, the federal government has sort of speculated about, and we've certainly talked to them about, the extension of wage subsidy programs and others. One of the questions we've also heard is the interaction between that and the SERB program. As we know, that's also put pressure on some businesses in terms of being able to affect the ability of businesses to operate, and because getting staff back because of the SERB ongoing. So those are exactly the kind of conversations that and I'll give the federal government, from the very beginning, Bill Morneau, who I've known for a number of years before I was in this role and before he was in that role, we've talked about these are going to be complicated interactions between the various necessary supports, and SERB very necessary, literally for millions of people, and how that interacts with the wage subsidy program and how that interacts with businesses' ability to get employees back. So lots of good dialogue going on there, and stay tuned.
Yeah, and we've heard a lot of that from our businesses as well, that they've had trouble getting their employees back because of SERB. We know that local sport is not a provincial jurisdiction, but it seems that sport, physical activity, and recreation, being a municipal responsibility, is falling between the cracks. These volunteer-driven, some professionally managed sports organizations provide thousands of hours of expert and responsible activity for all genders and ages each season, yet they are struggling with supporting contract employees, volunteers, and many may simply vanish, losing the contributions they make towards the vibrancy and health of our communities. Can something be done to help them recover?
Yeah, so very broad category, but it is one of the things our Minister of Sport, Tourism, and Heritage and Culture Industries, Lisa MacLeod, has been consulting quite extensively. Part of this, I think, as with all of these, as I think people would see, part of it is being able to get those businesses back to the extent they're businesses, or those organizations back so that they can operate. Because the karate conversation was a very good one, to the extent that they are able to have a business model that can generate fees and the kind of things that they've been able to do in the past. That's important, and facilities can be available. So we're working closely with municipalities about that. With regards to other supports, what we've been trying to do is make sure that to the extent they're eligible, they're able to take advantage of the supports, federal and provincial, that are available. And we're going to continue to look going forward at what is possible for government to do to try to support different sectors. I'd say things like the tourism, hospitality, and sports sectors have been some of the hardest hit because of just the very nature of those, either involving tourists which haven't been able to be here, or assemblies of people that can't get together, or just activities that right now our public health officials say are unsafe.
Right. As a small business in the promotional industry, we rely on large conventions, trade shows, sporting events, etc., with huge gatherings. When can we expect these events to be allowed?
Again, we'll rely on the advice we get from our public health officials, but again, the advice, and it's been quite public, that they would say is, large gatherings in the traditional form that they've been in before are going to be very difficult to have in the future. So we've seen an evolution of the gathering size limit with the numbers of people that can come together, and we've seen that in the case of, for example, religious services, the ability to have 30% of the capacity as one example. We've seen bigger groups being able to get together, and I think we can expect to see that evolution. It's hard to imagine a 50,000 person folk festival up at Molson Park, or whatever they call it up there now in Barrie. It's hard to imagine that in the format it's been in the very near future, because of the obvious issues of putting 50,000 people together. But there's a long distance between that and some of the things that people are talking about from an events perspective. And so we're just going to have that evolve as public health advice evolves. And obviously, as science evolves, a treatment, a vaccine, even effective treatments, those will make a big difference. And there is a great deal of work being done. One of the things I get to see almost on a daily basis is talk to some of the scientists and others that are working on those things. But those are from a business that I know as a business person before I did this, that doesn't help. The idea that there might be a vaccine at some point doesn't help me with my business plan for 2020.
Yeah, thank you. Another landlord question. What is the option when a landlord is willing to apply for rent subsidy, but the landlord's bank does not agree due to agreement landlord made with the bank to not decrease the rent charged?
Again, that'd be a really good specific instance if we could get the details of that. We have worked quite directly with a number of banks. We can't resolve for everything. If a particular landlord has a credit position related to their business before, there may be challenges that predate COVID, but we're happy to make sure that we understand all the circumstances so that the program itself at least isn't the impediment.
Okay, thank you. PPE costs are currently very high, even with vendors on the portal. Any opportunity that PPE expense would be considered as a tax credit if subsidy cannot be offered?
Yeah, so I think someone made a similar suggestion before, and it's we appreciate that. I think the other thing is, just to repeat, that I mentioned was, the province is considering whether or not the buying power, which we have considerable. If you can imagine all the PPE we have to buy for every hospital, every long-term care, all of the locations that we, whether it's courts or prisons or otherwise, and for those of you who are in the supply chain, are experts in supply chain, whether, at the scale we're buying at, we're not necessarily buying from a wholesaler when we might be buying 5 days of production or 30 days of production from an actual factory that's developing it. So we are looking at, are there ways that we can support business by just providing better prices? And then, of course, as pointed out, there's a number of domestic producers as well that have gotten into the business that we hope will drive costs down as they drive volumes up.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's the last question that I had that was submitted. If there are any other questions, if you could just type them into the chat, or if anyone would like to have a few minutes with the minister and MPP Parsa to let them know what your thoughts are on the reopening, I'm happy to hear you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, it's good. Listen, I'm happy to answer more questions. It's also great. I mean, I do think it is great to get direct feedback around what you're seeing or not seeing from a customer perspective. But just to take it back to one of the things Michael and I talked about earlier, it's this issue of generating confidence in the, among customers, among consumers, to re-engage. And I think our opening and reopening and the rules we set will be a factor in that. But again, looking to the experience in other jurisdictions, to some extent, I think people can overstate the extent to which government is actually driving it. We can tomorrow, if we said that everybody could go to a restaurant, the restaurants, at least compared to the in terms of the inside of a restaurants around the world, the experience they would tell us that they wouldn't all be full. There's a customer confidence and experience part of this that is really going to be important. So I'm certainly very interested in any other questions, but also any feedback on what people are seeing or what they think in that regard.
So one of the things that we're doing as a chamber is we will be putting out a booklet tomorrow. It's called The Road Ahead, Developing Your Reopening Operation Plan. And it's exactly that. It's things to think about as you're preparing to reopen and to make your clients and your customers and your staff feel comfortable about coming back into their place of work. So that's going to be released tomorrow. That'll be going out by email tomorrow morning. And as part of the Explore Aurora campaign, I invite everybody to go to exploreaurora.ca, where there are tools and suggestions on how businesses can communicate what they're doing to keep people safe to their public and to their employees. So we've tried to do some of those things for businesses to help them, and those tools are there for them. So hopefully people will start to use that and be really good about communicating what they're doing to the public, so that it's easier for them to feel confident when they go back. We have a few minutes, so Sam Palmerio, who's the Manager of Government Relations for Desjardins Group, requested a few minutes just to have a suggestion that he would like to bring forward on the recovery. So Sam, I believe you're unmuted.
Thanks, Sandra, and good afternoon, Minister Phillips and MPP Parsa. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I should mention that Desjardins has been a proud member of the Aurora community since 2006, and we've got some 1,500 folks who we normally congregate, get the pleasure of hanging out in Aurora, and I certainly miss that, hanging out in my room here, but so hopefully soon. we'll be back in town. And to your question about consumer confidence, I should mention I also participated in the town's COVID business continuity task force, and I just want to acknowledge the great work of Mayor Marakis and Sandra and others, and a few familiar faces on the screen from the task force. It's really all about consumer confidence and bringing that back and helping businesses recover. So kudos to the great work that's going on in Aurora. What I wanted to share in terms of recommendations more around the recovery program, and as you think around the budget, and I guess actually, Minister, it kind of goes back to your previous ministry when you worked on a Made in Ontario environmental plan. Just one suggestion from Desjardins is around infrastructure and ensuring that we modernize aging municipal water structures from a flood resilience perspective, a water damage perspective, and also a reminder that natural wetlands can actually be instrumental in terms of resiliency. Funny enough, stronger and less expensive than dams and other pieces. So as you think around stimulating the economy along with federal and municipal partners, we encourage you to think around infrastructure to improve resilience. So thank you for your time today.
No, Sam, thank you. And listen, one of the things that we're doing that hasn't been done yet in Canada, and it relates to my previous role, is a assessment relative to climate impacts that is going to be quite comprehensive. And you know, we think, and I've had this conversation with Bill Arno as well, has a lot of potential in terms of looking at how we shape some of the what will, you know, inevitably be significant infrastructure spends that become part of the recovery, right? And so how do you take the evolving understanding that we have from the work that was initiated in the Made in Ontario Environment Plan about understanding, you mentioned wetlands, or even some more efficient local systems in terms of handling waste and near wastewater, and not having to have all the, you know, not always having to have pipes in the ground, but some of the things that are quite progressive. I think COVID is going to accelerate a number of trends in terms of things in it. So it's an opportunity to move forward some of those other agenda items. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Sam. There was another question that just came in regarding the emergency order. They're wondering whether it'll be extended. You believe that it'll be extended beyond July 15th?
It's one of the things that very much, I mean, we would like very much to move beyond the emergency situation, if for no other reason that it's hard to make people feel comfortable in terms of coming back and feeling normal when you're under a state of emergency. And you know, the Premier has always been clear about, you know, the extraordinary powers that the government grants itself at these times have to be seen very much as an exception. So we're looking at how, you know, what needs to be done in terms of the phasing. We talked about earlier the different stages and how that's working. What other mechanisms there are other than the emergency order mechanism. There may be some things that are required on an ongoing basis. And you know, one of the areas, I'm not sure what the mayor thinks, but we got a lot of positive feedback, for example, on enabling council meetings to happen, you know, digitally, if not council, some of the committee meetings, just as a more efficient way to operate in the era of social distancing. So there's many orders that have been made under the emergency orders, some of which may be things that we want to have continue, at least for the medium term. So we're looking at different options to do that wouldn't require the emergency orders. But right now, that's the capacities that we have to do the things we need to do, not just in terms of limiting activity, but even in terms of the flexibility that it's granting us inside the healthcare system to move staff as required. You know, these are things that we need to make sure, you know, we have the authorities we need to do the things you have to do, ideally without the emergency piece. So we'll get out from under it as quick as we can, but we're going to probably have learned some things about some elements that might be helpful, at least in the medium term, if not permanently, to be helpful.
Thank you. And lastly, I think there was just a thank you note to MPP Parsa on behalf of the Martial Arts School, just talking about how wonderful your office was and how helpful that you've been with them. So Michael, and I know that's my experience as well. Whenever I've reached out to you or Kai or Shay, anyone at your office, they're always very responsive. So I want to thank you for that. And if there are no other questions, are there any other questions? challenges, anything that you'd like to bring forward?
I
No?
think there's a question in the chat about restaurants, Sandra, from Anu.
Did I miss it? Oh, as restaurants are getting option to use parking lot for extending patios, will this be applicable for other businesses to conduct screening outside their units? Our landlord is charging lawyer fees to allow this to happen.
I think that might be if the mayor's on them, I guess whatever flexibility, and it's been great. We've certainly encouraged it, but a lot of municipalities have been just fantastic about amending their local bylaws and requirements to allow for parking lots to be used, on a temporary basis for things. So I don't want to put him on the spot, but I think that's the kind of question that might be best directed to the municipal folks.
And the mayor and I actually talked about that this morning. Mayor Maracus, do you want to say something? Are you muted?
Sure. Yeah. No. Thanks, Minister, for putting me on the spot. So I appreciate that.
Usually it's the other way around. So I appreciate you having that. Thank you for that.
No. Well, first off, I mean, since I just jumped on, thank you very much for attending this. Much appreciated, and thank you for all the information and everything that you guys are doing at the provincial level to help with all the things that we're going through at the municipal and local level. So thank you very much for all of that. Mr. Phillips is correct. We're looking at all options when it comes to patios for all the businesses. Some of the things that we do need to be careful about is that we have to make sure that there's still enough parking spots. So, but we are working to make sure that any businesses can utilize as much space as possible to allow flexibility as they begin to reopen to make sure that they can start to thrive again. So we're working through that. We're also cutting a lot of the red tape and the costs through that to make sure that it's as quick and easy to get you up and running as fast as possible. So.
Thank you. So there was another question. If you socially distance and put 50 on a patio, how many participants can you have in martial arts, yoga, Pilates gyms? Well, that's a very specific question. So not sure if you'll have the answer to something like that, but.
A little beyond my capacity to
Okay. Yeah, and the rest are all.
But I would point to we have 34 public health units. They've obviously been very, very busy, but I have to say, in general, I can't comment specifically on York Region, although I'm sure it's fine, but a good one. But there generally is pretty good answers. It's a matter of just getting the time to talk to the officials. They usually have some pretty good advice about what and how to do things.
Yeah. Terrific. And that's one of the links that's in the booklet. So I'm going to say thank you to everyone once again for joining us today. I hope you found the dialogue useful and informative. I would like to thank Minister Rod Phillips and MPP Michael Parsa for joining us today and for your openness to answering all of our questions. So thank you very much for that. In closing, I just want to tell everyone to take a look at your email tomorrow morning for our booklet that's coming out, The Road Ahead, Developing Your Reopening Operation Plan. And it'll all have live links that will take you to forms, checklists, posters, and all the things that you need to reopen safely. As always, the chamber is just a phone call away. Everyone knows how to reach us, so just reach out if there's anything we can do for you. And thank you all again for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Phillips. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Very insightful. Thank you. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Minister Phillips.
Great
Thanks,
call.
Mayor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being on this. And if I can be of any help, you know how to get a hold of me. Please let me know. And Sandra, thank you and your team for all your help. I meant it. It's been great working with all of you. Thank you for helping our businesses. You know how important it is. This is a time that they need us more than ever. So thank you very much for everything, guys.
Michael, I think our next meeting is on the patio.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
I can't wait. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks, Michael. Bye-bye.
Happy Canada Day.
Happy
Canada
Canada
Day.
Day to all of you.